Hey guys, good morning. Right now I'm going to be recording the Chapter 9 lecture on intelligence. So first of all, here are our gateway questions. This is what we're going to be going through in this chapter. We're going to go through the first couple of questions up through question 3. The rest of it is going to be in a separate video. So first of all, I really like this quote from Stephen Hawking when he was asked about what his IQ score was. And he said, "I have no idea. People who boast about their IQs are losers." So keep that in mind next time you maybe want to share the results of your IQ test. So we're going to start off with some key terms. Intelligence. Now, intelligence is a really, really difficult thing that theorists and psychologists and palmetric testers, which we're going to talk about later on, have been debating for centuries. But from this textbook, the definition that they give for intelligence is an overall capacity to think rationally, act purposefully, and adapt to one's surroundings. So that's a really all-encompassing term. So thinking rationally, understanding things that are going around you, making logical choices, acting purposefully, so having a directed response, and then adapting to one's surroundings. So as things change or shift, you can actually adapt appropriately. Now, theorists have long been trying to decide whether there was one overall intelligence measurement or if we had multiple smaller factors of intelligence that they called the G factor, G standing for general. So the G factor is the general ability factor proposed to underline intelligence. This is a core intellectual ability that involves reasoning, problem-solving ability, knowledge, and memory. So this is the idea that there's one overarching type of intelligence. That's the G factor, a general intelligence factor. However, other people think that there are multiple smaller intelligences that are important, and we can measure them each separately and that they don't really impact one another. So mathematical intelligence, artistic intelligence, natural intelligence. And depending on who you talk to in this field of intelligence testing, they may or may not subscribe to this factor, this idea of the G factor, the general intelligence score that is usable, or people who might believe that there are subtypes of intelligence that need to be looked at individually. So the G factor, again, is the general mental abilities. It probably doesn't exist. There probably are some different types of intelligences. Some people say there's anywhere between 3 to 7 to 30 different types of intelligences. But it just depends on who you talk to. We can measure these things differently. And there are tons of IQ tests out there in the world. And they all claim to measure some type of intelligence. But what they're actually measuring that relates to your overall capacity to think rationally, act purposefully, and adapt to your surroundings, they're all slightly different than one another. So it can be hard to determine that all in one score. We also want to talk about aptitudes. So an aptitude is capacity for learning certain abilities. It could be mechanical abilities, your ability to put something together and make it work. Think of like putting together Legos, something like that. It could be artistic talent, painting, drawing, music. It could be verbal intelligence, being able to explain yourself verbally, whether it's spoken word or written word. Musical abilities. These are all aptitudes. And there are certain tests that look to predict your success in that one area. And a lot of these actually focus on a type of work skill you might have. So you could take a test to see how successful you might be as a mechanic. These aren't, it's like if you took a special math test. So how good are you at mathematics, or how good are you artistically? You don't see these all too often in the general public. Usually we're testing multiple aptitudes at once. But for an example, in the Army, when people come into the Army, they will oftentimes give them a special aptitude test to help select what career they're going to have within the Army. Not everyone does everything. So maybe you're a mechanic, maybe you are a computer technician, maybe you are more on the ground forces, and those can all be determined by a special aptitude test. Like I said, multiple aptitude tests are a little bit more common. They measure 2 or more aptitudes at the same time. So if you took a test to see what major you should pursue or career you should pursue, You may have taken some of those in S2S, or you might shortly. I think the FAU career website has a couple of these on there. They might point you in the direction of a career that might be a good fit for you, but they're testing multiple aptitudes at once. The SAT, that looks verbal, math, and I believe written. GRE is the graduate entrance exam. That one is focusing, again, written, verbal, and mathematical. LSAT is for law. MCAT is for medicine, and they each kind of look at multiple different aptitudes. In most general intelligence tests, if you've ever taken an IQ test, they're testing a wide variety of mental abilities. They're not just focusing on one specific area. They're testing a bunch of different things. If you've ever taken one of these tests, you'll be able to determine that pretty quickly. So intelligence, we're going to be talking about how we assess intelligence, conceptualize it, some biological influences, and then later on, in the next lecture section, we're going to talk about some extremes of intelligence. So the major question that we have to ask when someone is designing an IQ test or is telling you that they've designed an IQ test is we want to look at the reliability and the validity of that test. So if we go here, any test that measures someone's mental functions, it's called a psychometric test. You can take psychometric tests with psychiatrists, psychologists. They have psychometric testing trained people, and that's like their job is to give IQ tests. School psychologists oftentimes will do this type of thing. There's testing centers that do this. But any test that they're giving, we have to ask, is the test reliable and is it valid? So reliability is a measurement of looking to see if the test will give the same score or a very close score each time it's given to that person. So you want it to be consistent and highly correlated. So for an example, a pregnancy test, it should give you the same answer if you take it twice in the same day. If your pregnancy status has not changed and you take a pregnancy test, and especially if it's a guy, like he takes a pregnancy test, it says he's, not pregnant, and he takes it later on the same day, and again, it says it's not pregnant, that's a reliable test. But if it says pregnant one time and not pregnant another time, that's not a reliable test. If you stepped on a scale, and one time it said you weighed 100 pounds, another time it said 150 pounds, another time it said you were 130. That's not a reliable scale. Something's going on with the mechanisms in that. You wouldn't rely on that. You wouldn't just average it and be like, oh, now I'm good. That's not how that works. With an IQ test, the score should be pretty close each time. You might get a slight increase each time a person takes it because they get more used to the test format. And they also may mature over time. So if they take it every 3 months, obviously they might be in more school, they're a little bit older, they have more life experience, they would do a little bit better. But it should be pretty close if it's a reliable test. And then validity is the ability of the test to measure what it actually says it's measuring. A pregnancy test should look for signs of pregnancy, not, how many waffles you ate that morning. That has nothing to do with pregnancy. If I said I had to give you a test and I gave you a biology exam instead, that's not a valid measurement of your knowledge of psychology. That's a measure of your knowledge in biology. That's not a valid test for a psychology class. If you are interested, there are free IQ tests available online, but most of them are pretty poor in validity because they're not standardized the same way that actual psychometric tests are standardized. So those are really important differences. If you go online and you see you have a really high IQ, a really low IQ, from some free online IQ test, it's not a valid test. So don't be too proud or too freaked out by your answers. It's pretty meaningless. And going back to the last slide, so this picture here, this is a picture of 4 different handwriting samples, and this kind of comes from a pseudoscientific topic called graphology. Some people used to believe that the style that you wrote, like with your handwriting, said something about your IQ, your personality, your tendencies of your behavior. And so there were some people who considered themselves to be graphologists, people who studied this, who could look at people's handwriting and tell other people a whole host about that person's personality, IQ, and behaviors. Some companies would hire graphologists to assess the handwriting of certain applicants to see if they'd be a good fit for the company. crime scene detectives would look at handwriting samples and be like, oh, this person's definitely a psychopath because their handwriting slants so much, or has to do, they would look at the slant, they would look at the size of the letters, they would look at, if you cross a T, how high up on the cross is the strike through, or if the dot over the I, is it directly over, is it really high, is it really low, is it to the right, to the left? All those things would be signs that they would look for to look at people's personalities. But again, like I said, it's pseudoscientific. There's no reliability or validity to graphology, which makes it a poor test. So it's something that we are not going to focus on is graphology. So we have to always ask when we're doing an IQ test, is that test reliable and is it valid? Now, the IQ tests that are out today have been shown to be reliable and as valid as we possibly can without having a perfect definition of intelligence. They're good, they're not perfect, but the best that we've been able to come up with over the course of about 150 years. So if you were to make an IQ test and it shows that you are the smartest person in the world, is that an objective test? Of course not. So we also have to make sure that our tests that we are giving and administering are objective. That means that a test will give the same score when different people correct it. This can be done in a variety of different ways. And so we have to maybe use a rubric in order to score it. So for an example, a multiple choice test, you have an answer key that has the correct answers on it. So you know what answer is correct or incorrect. But when it comes to things that are harder to score, like writing, so essays, Miss Baker and Miss Cross, they have rubrics that they use to objectively assess each of your writing samples. And if myself were to come in and I understood the assignment and I understood the material that you guys were reading, would I be able to get a very similar score? And hopefully, with an objective measurement, I would be able to do that with a good rubric. We also have test standardization procedures. So that's when we give the same procedures for every person who takes that test. So using the same calculator, same location, same time, same materials. And we also use the same procedures for interpreting the results, an answer key or a rubric. If you've gone and taken the PSAT or you do that like next year, you're going to see that there's very strict standards of test standardization to make sure that every single person who takes that in the entire world or the entire country gets the exact same test procedures to make sure that that test is as objective as possible. We also have norms. This is an average score for a designated group of people. You've probably seen like, oh, I scored in the 60th percentile or the 80th percentile. That doesn't, so if you got, say, the 80th percentile, doesn't mean you got 80% of the questions correct. What that means is that you scored at the 80th point. So out of all the people who have taken the test, you scored higher than 80% of them, but you scored lower than 20% of them. So 80th percentile means that 80% of people scored the same or lower than you did. For an example, how this doesn't work to be like raw percentages, if you were to take the GRE, the Graduate Record Exam, which is like the SAT for grad school, if you got every single question on the math portion correct, you would still only be in the 95th percentile because about 5% of people score a perfect score on the math portion. I was not part of that. But there are groups of people who take that test who score so high that 5% of people get everything correct. So if you score a perfect score, you're only in the 95th percentile, but that's still very good. So we're going to talk about the history of assessing intelligence. So today we know that psychologists view intelligence broadly and it has mental abilities that allow you to adapt to your environment and behave in a goal-directed way. But of course, this is a really difficult thing to measure, and it's taken like almost 200 years to kind of figure this out. IQ tests were begun by two men named Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon. They began trying to assess intelligence after they were given the directive from the French government to try to measure intelligence of French children. At this time in the French government, they had finished the revolution and they were trying to provide free education, like standardized education for all the children in their country. Just like we have it here in the United States, we have public schools. They were going to do the same thing in France. They did it before the United States. And some of these kids were coming from homes that had private tutors, their parents were educated, so they probably knew quite a bit coming into the classroom. Other kids had come from families that were illiterate, they had had no education previous, and so say you're putting a bunch of third graders together, well, some of them may have had private tutors and could speak multiple languages and read and do mathematics, but others had no education. So you're putting them together and you're trying to see who needs extra help and who may have maybe some mental health deficits. And so these two men were trying to figure out a way to measure that to see which students were going to need more help. Alfred Binet, he believed that intelligence makes a person a good problem solver. So he made up little testing situations that would measure attention, judgment, and reasoning skills. And by doing so, he would assess how a children would perform on these different test questions and different. They even had like little manipulable blocks and stuff like that. And then he would find out what your mental age was for those skills. And then you take your mental age and you would divide it by the chronological age, and you could see if the child was above average or below average or equal intelligence for their age. So let's say you're testing a 5-year-old and they test with a mental age of a 10-year-old. So they're really way advanced for their age. So their mental age is age 10, but they're chronologically only 5 years old. They're doing really well. They're above average intelligence. But if you test a 5-year-old and they have the mental age of a 3-year-old, they're below where they should be for that point. And so that would be a lower than average intelligence. But if it's a 5-year-old and they test at a 5-year-old level, then they're right where they should be for their age. So here's some examples, some types of questions. So on the left here, there's a picture. So in one question, they would ask the child to assemble the blocks to make the pattern that they see on the right. And they would see how long it takes and how many manipulations of the blocks it would take. So how many times it did twist or flip the block. The second one, they have to complete the logical sequence. So they would see the first one with the squares and the triangles and the smaller triangles. And then they would show them the array of the 4 choices and ask them which one completes that sequence. They would also then do the one on the bottom, which of these 3 pieces go together to make the puzzle. And the person would have to kind of look at it, analyze it, and try to figure out which 3 pieces would make up that puzzle piece. They also would do fluid reasoning. So an apprentice is to a master as a novice is to a... So that's an analogy. So an apprentice is to a master. So someone who's learning is to a person who really knows what they're doing. A novice is to a expert, in case you were wondering and that's bothering you. Knowledge. So why is yeast added to bread dough? So that's just basic knowledge. Quantitative reasoning. So I have 6 marbles and you give me another one. How many do I have? Some basic math. Visual spatial processing we saw on the right, as well as working memory. So they would read off a few sentences, ask the person to remember the last word from each sentence, and then see how many sentences they could hold in their memory. Now, some of these skills are based off of just your ability to solve problems. You don't need any background information in order to do that. But things like knowledge, so like why is yeast added to bread dough? If you've never baked before, maybe you come from a super wealthy family, you don't watch cooking shows, everything's been handed to you, you've never had to cook anything, you might not know that. But if you're a person who works in a bakery, of course you're going to know that. If I ask you questions about how farming is done, you guys would be clueless. I'm sure most of you guys have no idea how to do basic farming practices and animal husbandry practices. But, kids who had that experience would do really well in that. Now, of course, because it was like the 1860s, 1870s when they started doing this, and it was old, rich white men, see, the man in the picture there, a lot of their questions that were knowledge-based were focused more heavily on questions that they knew the answers to and didn't necessarily reflect the experiences of more diverse audiences. And so in their testing that they did, rich students, wealthier students, and white students perform better than non-white students or students who were from less privileged backgrounds because they were asking questions that they just didn't know. Like, how do you use a telephone? Well, if you've never seen a telephone because you don't have a telephone in your household, these are things that are difficult for them to answer. Obviously, we've made great strides in changing those things, but it's still it's imperfect, of course. Today, one of the major intelligence tests that we use is called the Weissler Intelligence Scale. For adults, it's in its 4th edition. It's known as the WAIS 4, and then the Weissler Intelligence Scale for children is the WAIS 5, 5th edition. And then these compare scores of nonverbal intelligence, so solving puzzles, assembling objects, completing pictures, other nonverbal tasks, as well as verbal intelligence, where you answer questions involving vocabulary, general information, arithmetic, and other language or symbol-oriented tasks. Also, as like a stand-in for intelligence tests, a lot of people will use the SAT, ACT, which is the American College test that's used a lot in the Midwest instead of the SAT. There's also the CQT. I don't know where that's used, but that's another type of test people use. It's like a stand-in for intelligence. If you take an IQ test, you get what they call an intelligence quotient score, an IQ score. Intelligence and IQ are not exactly the same thing. An IQ is the numerical score, but intelligence is a more broad term. So keep that in mind. But an IQ test is an index that's supposed to measure intelligence as defined by your mental age divided by his or her chronicle age multiplied by 100. So here's an example. A 10-year-old child has a mental age of 12. So you take the mental age of 12 divided by the chronological age of 10, multiply that by 100, and you can see that the IQ is 120. Now, IQs have been standardized on a normal curve. That means that most people fall in the middle, and only a few people here fall on either extreme end. It's also called a bell curve. You may have seen this before. I'll post a video that kind of shows how that operates numerically. But so most people are going to score kind of in this center region. A couple people will, a good number of people will kind of score outside this middle section, and then just a small number of people will be really far out here on the ends. Now, for IQ, it has been standardized that the average IQ score is 100. It's a nice, easy, round number, and it makes it easy for psychologists as well as the lay people to understand it. Now, one standard deviation, meaning one essentially significant step up from 100 is considered to be 15 points or get you to 115. If you go 15 points below, you're 85. So this is kind of the majority of people, about 70% of people kind of fall within this range here, between 85 and 115. This is most people in the world. If you go above that, you get to 130 and 70. So about 90-something% of people fall between 70 and 130. Anything below 70 we consider to be intellectually deficient or having an intellectual disability. People with an IQ below 70, they struggle to maintain basic life functioning, to manage their own affairs, to keep their personal hygiene at an acceptable level. But people who are above 130, they have significant advantages. They're considered to be intellectually gifted and have, some benefits as far as what they can do intellectually in their personal life as well as in the workforce. Now, it doesn't mean these people are necessarily completely unsuccessful. These people are completely successful. That can fluctuate depending on personal motivation and education and things like that. Now, you may have heard the terms of imbecile, moron, and idiot. You probably have heard those terms, right? We use them as slang terms to insult someone. But those used to actually be designations of people's level of intelligence. So I believe it was like idiot was like 70 or below, moron was 55 and below, and imbecile was 40 and below. We don't use those terms obviously anymore. They've been kind of turned into these insults that we use colloquially, but that's where those terminologies come from. So if you ever hear someone called an idiot savant, we'll talk about savant syndrome later on, that's where that term comes from, is that they would have this low IQ, but this intellectual giftedness in one specific area. And again, we'll talk about that in section 2 of this chapter. So we'll talk about extremes of intelligence, high and low, later on. But this deviation IQ, so again, most people fall between this 70 point and 130 point. This is the vast majority of people in the world. Culture also plays a role in IQ, and there's a really good video about this on YouTube that I want you guys to check out in the playlist about the Aboriginal people in Australia and how their IQ is a little bit different than white Australian IQ. So I want you to check that out. If you know anything about the Aboriginal people, it's kind of like the same thing that happened here in the United States with our native populations. They were systematically killed. They were infected with diseases that they didn't have any resistance to. They were taken from their homes, especially Aboriginal children, and placed into foster situations or in group homes, and made to be more European in the way that they spoke, the way that they dressed, the way that they acted, and the way that they worshipped. So there's been centuries of mistreatment towards Aboriginal people, just like we've had here in the United States with our native populations. They generally score lower on IQ tests than white Australian children. And again, this comes down to access to education and healthcare, nutrition, wealth status, and things like that. But this one researcher found out, and you'll see this in the video, that the Aboriginal children have an advantage when it comes to their spatial IQ. When she gives them a specific test that looks at spatial IQ, they actually perform at a rate of 3 years more advanced than white Australian children because of the structure of their day-to-day life in the outback of Australia. So if you think about like our spatial abilities are kind of getting around our house, getting around our neighborhood, maybe driving to the store, but these Aboriginal children, they have to get through large tracts of land to find food, water, to avoid predators, to avoid poisonous snakes and things like that. So their spatial scores are much more advanced than white Australian children. So please take a chance and watch that video on YouTube. So different cultures value different types of intelligence. And again, Aboriginal people, they value the ability to find your way across vast distances. It actually even kind of comes down into their language. In the Aboriginal language, instead of saying, oh, this object is to the right of me and this object is to the left of me, you say, oh, this object is to the east of me and this other object is to my west. So I could say, oh, you are sitting to my north instead of, oh, you're sitting in front of me. So cardinal directionality is built into their language as like a foundation, and they find it very strange that other people can't do this. Like it just boggles their mind that people don't have this direct ability to understand directionality the way that they can. We also know that different people have different pressure to understand natural environments, mechanical systems, verbal, emotional, mathematical. Here in the U.S., we really value verbal and mathematical attention and skills, versus in other areas, more natural and emotional skill sets are more highly prized because that's what it takes to be successful in that environment. So we can't necessarily say that other cultures are more or less intelligent than ourselves. We just have to look at them and say they just have different types of intelligence that are valued in that population. This kind of goes back to our chapter 1 study on the Nasarima people. We want to make sure that we're being unbiased in our perspective of, who's better than another group. When it comes to IQ and age, when we look at testing for young children, it's really unreliable. Any IQ test that's done before age 11 is unlikely to hold up. And even throughout adolescence, we see a lot of change. So maybe some of you guys had an IQ test or a gifted test given to you when you were in kindergarten or early elementary school. And your parents have always been like, oh man, look how smart my kid is. No offense, but that may have changed a whole lot in the last couple of years because IQ testing with young children is extremely unreliable. People have been trying to do it with babies and with kids for years. It just doesn't work out very well. We do see gradual increases in IQ between middle childhood and age 40. Again, you're expanding your knowledge, your education, your life experience in great deal in that time period. We also see that IQ is a reflection of the person's age. As we said, that there's a gradual increase. One's education. Education systems push you to think more broadly, more critically, more rationally, using inductive and deductive reasoning. That's all being done in the education system on a daily basis. Your maturity plays a role in this, and then just your life experience. If you've never encountered certain problems, you may just not have that experience. But if you do encounter those issues, then you can overcome that and you gain that knowledge and that intelligence from it. Fluid intelligence, we talked about this back in chapter 3, but that's the ability to solve novel problems using perceptual speed and rapid insight, and this declines after middle age. This is where, new technologies become really difficult to learn after a certain point. So again, if one of your parents or their grandparents get a new DVR system, it's like the end of the world, they'll never figure it out. However, you're young, you have this rapid fluid intelligence ability, and so these things are easy to learn, easy to interpret, and to adapt to. Crystallized intelligence, on the other hand, is the ability to solve problems using the knowledge that you already have. And this increases throughout your entire life. And this is just your ability to learn things based off experience and education. So in general, young people are quick learners. They have a lot of fluid intelligence, but they tend to be what we call wet behind the ears, meaning that you lack experience and crystallized intelligence that would enable you to maybe have some foresight or understand problems before they happen because you've just never experienced that before. If you've played maybe Jeopardy against your parents, they may do better than you because even though they struggle with the new DVR, they have a lot of that crystallized intelligence. They have a lot of facts and dates and just knowledge because they've lived through a whole bunch of stuff. When we look at IQ, sex, and achievement, there's almost no difference between the IQ scores of men and women on modern IQ tests. In the past, women did not score as well, but that's because they had biased test questions. And so men and women now score very close to the same scores. We do see small differences in math and spatial IQ. Typically, women score lower in math and spatial tests than men do, but this is likely due to encouragement differences and education differences. So girls from a young age, not so much anymore, but historically have not been encouraged to pursue mathematics and engineering and to perform spatial activities. Even from a young age, girls are encouraged to have to do emotional play and caretaking play. So think of like baby dolls and playing playing house and dress up and things like that. Versus boys are encouraged to play with Legos and building blocks and to go out in cars. And so move around little cars. So these differences, even in play in childhood, can result in differences in IQ later on. But when those things are held constant, we see those differences go away. But a few points here and there mean almost nothing. So if you like, oh, my IQ is 125, and your friend's like, oh, I have an IQ of 128, who cares? Like 3 points is nothing. That could just be, a difference in 1 or 2 questions or, guessing incorrectly or guessing correctly on a question. There is a moderate association between grades and job performance. So if you have a high IQ, you're more likely to do better in school and have better job performance, but motivation also plays a really large role. You probably knew those from your middle school, these kids who were extremely intelligent. They were just so smart, but they just weren't motivated. And maybe even you're seeing this here. Even though you might be very, very bright, if you're not motivated to get the work done, you don't have the time management skills, you won't do as well. So motivation plays a larger role. That's one of the things I tell you guys at the beginning of the school year. I don't care how smart you are, I care how hard you work. And I think that's kind of a theme throughout our program. IQ is not a predictor in success in art, music, writing, dramatics, science, and leadership. It doesn't really matter what your IQ score is. You'll do well as long as it's kind of within that normal range. But if people have extremely low IQs or extremely high IQs, we do see a higher link to success. So that means that if you have an IQ of below 70, you're very likely going to struggle in any career field. But if you have an IQ of 140 or higher, you have a very high link to success. You're going to do well if you put your mind to it. All right, so I'm going to stop here. This is going to be the end of section 1, and we'll start section 2 later on.